The Manchester Man by Mrs. George Linnaeus Banks. Chapter 9. The Snake. However ambitious either Jabez or his kind fosterers had been to see him a blue-coat boy, the parting between them was a terrible wrench. They were to him all the friends or parents he had ever known. Then there were his playmates in the yard, with liberty to run in and out at will. And lastly there were his dumb pets, his kitten grown to a cat, his pigeons, and the tame linnet hopping from perch to finger, and paying him for his love with the sweetest of songs. He was not more stunned by the noise and Easter Monday bustle in the college yard, or more awed by the imposing presence of Governor Terry and the Fifis, than by the magnitude, order, and antique grandeur of the building henceforth to be his home. Nevertheless, wide open as the gates were for the day, he felt that they would close and shut him in among the cold strong walls and strangers, never to see his pets or his loving friends again, until Whitsuntide should bring another holiday. They, older, more experienced, with a better knowledge of all the boy would gain, all the privation and premature labour he would escape, felt only how dull their humble home would be, without the willing feet and hands, the smiling face and the cheerful voice of the sturdy little fellow, who for more than 7 years had been as their own child. He had given his last charge respecting his furry and feathered brood, exchanged the last clinging embrace under the dark arch, then tore away in quest of a deserted corner, where he could hide the tears he could not wholly restrain. At first, the new dress of which he was so proud, the yellow stockings and clasped shoes in place of clogs, the yellow baize petticoat, the long-skirted blue overcoat or gown, the blue muffin cap, the white clerical band at the throat, all neat and fresh and unpatched as they were, felt awkward and uncomfortable. The long petticoat especially incommoded him. But in a few days this wore off. There were other lads equally strange and unaccustomed to robes and rules. Fellow feeling drew them towards each other, and with wonderful adaptability of childhood they fell into the regular grooves, and were as much at home as the eldest there in less than a fortnight. And from the Chetham Gallery in the old church he could see and be seen by Simon and Bess on Sabbath mornings from the free seats in the aisle, and that contented them. The training and education of the Chetham College boys was, and is, conducted on principles best adapted for boys expected to fight their way upwards in the world. They were not encumbered with a number of ologies and isms. The highest education did not stand on a par then with the moderate ones of this day. Their range of books and studies was limited. Reading, writing, and arithmetic, sound and practical information alone were imparted, so much as was needed to fit the dullest for an ordinary tradesman, and supply the persevering and intelligent with a fulcrum and a lever. Nor did their education end with their lessons in the schoolroom, nor was it drawn from books and slates alone. Their meals were regular, their diet pure and ample, but plain. They rose at 6, began the day with prayer, and retired to rest at 8. Besides their duties in the schoolroom, they darned their own stockings, made their own beds, helped the servants to keep their rooms clean, and 6 of the elder boys were set apart to run errands and carry messages beyond the precincts of the college. Strength of muscle and limb were gained in the open courtyard, in such games as trap and football. Patience and ingenuity had scope in the bead purses, the carved apple scoops and marrow spoons, the worsted balls and pincushions they made to fill their leisure hours indoors. There was no idleness. Their very play had its purpose. Let us set Jabez Clegg under the kind guardianship of Christopher Terry, the governor, and under the direct supervision of the Reverend John Grasswell, the schoolmaster, to con his maver and make pothooks and ladles on a form in the large schoolroom at the east end of the college, and to rise step by step up the first difficult rungs of that long ladder of learning, which may indeed rest on our common earth, but which reaches far above the clouds and human ken. Christmas and midsummer vacations came and went. So did those red-letter days of his college life, Easter and Whitsuntide, when he was free to rush to the old yard so near at hand, and after hugging Bess and Simon, whom he astonished with his learning, could assure himself his dumb family had been well cared for. And if those passing seasons traced deeper lines on Simon's brow, gave more womanly solidity to Bess's form and character, they brought no change the foundling could mark. Tom Hume's whereabouts was still undiscovered. Matt Cooper was still a widower, but they and his masters could note the steady progress he made, and his chivalrous love of truth and sense of honour shone in many ways in little things. Yet there was one event a grief to him. His little brown linnet pined for its young friend, and died before the first Whitsunday came. He was not much over 10 years old when he was proved to possess courage, as well as truth and honour. For some time Nancy, the cook, had observed that the cream was skimmed surreptitiously from the milk pans in the dairy, that the milk itself was regularly abstracted, and she was loud in complaint. She could scarcely find cream enough to set on the governor's table, and servants and schoolboys were in turn accused of being the depredators. Complaints were made to Mr. Terry. Servants and boys were alike interrogated and watched and punished on suspicion, but nothing could be proved, and no precautions could save the milk. The lofty and spacious kitchen had its entrance almost under the porch, and close beside it was a flight of stone steps leading to the dairy, a cellar below the kitchen, lit by a small window high up on the side towards the river, and of course opposite to the steps. Stone tables occupied the two other sides, on which were ranged a number of wide shallow pans of good milk. In the extreme corner, at right angles with the door, at the head of the stairs, was another entrance, a small oaken door in a Gothic frame, which opened on another and shorter flight of steps, cut in the rock and washed by the river, which sometimes rose and beat against the cellar door for admission, beat so oft and importunately as to wear away the oak where it met the floor. It was nearly breakfast time. Long rows of wooden bowls and trenchers were ranged on the white kitchen table. The oatmeal porridge was ready to pour out. The cook ran short of milk. Through a window overlooking the yard she espied Jabez, whip in hand, driving a biped team of play horses. "Jabez, Jabez Clegg," she called out at the pitch of her voice, "come hither." Down went the reins, and the prancing steeds proceeded without a driver. "Fetch a can of milk from the cellar, Jabez, and look sharp, and see as you dinna drunk none." "I never do," said Jabez, not over-pleased at the imputation. "Well, see as you don't, for some on you do." Jabez took the bright tin can, without putting down the whip, and descended the unguarded cellar steps, whistling as he went. He gave a jump down the last few steps, and to his utter surprise, I cannot say dismay, saw that he had disturbed a great greenish-brown snake, spotted with black and having a yellowish ring round its neck. It lay coiled on the stone table opposite to him, and with its head elevated above the rim of a milk pan, was taking its morning draught, and in so doing reckoning without its host. "Oh, you're the thief, are you, Mr. Snake? It's you've robbed us of our milk and got us boys thrashed for it," cried Jabez without a thought of danger, planting himself between the culprit and the small postern door, as the snake, gliding from the slab, turned thither for exit, putting out its forked tongue and hissing at him as it came. Without thought or consideration, without a cry of alarm to those above, he struck at the threatening foe with his whip, and as the resentful snake darted at him, jumped nimbly aside, and struck again, and as the angry snake writhed and twisted, and again darted its frightful head at him with distended jaws, he whipped and whipped away as though a top and not a formidable reptile had been before him. Cook, out of patience, called "Jabez Clegg" more than once, in anything but satisfactory tones, and then, patience exhausted, came to the top of the dairy steps. Then she heard Jabez, as if addressing someone, say, "Oh, you would you?" And the commotion having drawn her so far down the steps that she could peer into the cellar and see what was going on, she set up a prolonged scream. This was just as Jabez, shifting the position of his whip, brought the butt end down on the head of the snake with all the force of his stout young arm, and his exhausted foe dropped, literally whipped to death. The woman's screams brought not only the governor and the schoolmaster, but Dr. Stone, the librarian, to the spot, and there stood Jabez, all his prowess gone, with his back towards them, his head down on his arms, which rested on the stone slab, sobbing violently for the very life he had just destroyed. "Oh, he's been bitten, he's been bitten! The venomous thing's bitten the lad, he'll die after it!" cried the cook in an ecstasy of terror. "Stand aside, Nancy," said Dr. Stone. "That snake is not venomous. If I mistake not, the brave boy's heart is wounded, not his skin." And coming down, the kind, discerning librarian lifted the snake with the one hand and took hold of Jabez with the other, simply saying to him, "Come into the governor's room, Jabez, and tell us all about it." And Jabez, drying his red eyes on the cuff of his coat, was ushered before the doctor up the stairs and into the governor's room, where breakfast was laid for the three gentlemen. There he briefly told how he had found the snake drinking the milk, and having intercepted the reptile's retreat, had been obliged in self-defence to fight with it, until he had whipped it to death, a consummation as unlooked for as regretted. He had not, as at first surmised, escaped unwounded in the contest, but, as Dr. Stone had said, and the surgeon who dressed the bites confirmed, the terrible-looking reptile was but the common ring snake, which takes freely to the water, and its bite was harmless. From the dais in the refectory both snake and whip were exhibited to the boys after breakfast. "My lads," said the governor, "I dare say you will all be glad to know that the thief who stole the milk has been taken." There was a general shout of assent, with here and there a wondering glance at the vacant seat of Jabez, who, having his wounds washed and bound up, had not sat down with them, but had a sort of complimentary breakfast with the servants in the kitchen. "And I dare say you would like to see the thief and know how he was caught." There was another general, "Aye, aye, sir." "Well, here he is," and he held the snake aloft, "but I don't think any of you will be thrashed on his account again. Jabez Clegg here," and he pulled the reluctant boy forward by the shoulder, "caught the sly robber drinking the milk, and with nothing but this whip and a fearless, resolute arm, put a stop to his depredations, and restored the lost character of the school." There was a loud hurrah for Jabez Clegg, who for the time being was a hero. Then, the snake being carried to the schoolroom, the Reverend John Gresswell improved the occasion by a lesson on snakes in general, and that one in particular. But when he dissipated the popular belief that all snakes were venomous, and assured the boys that the bite of this was innocuous, more than one of the blue-coated lads thought Jabez was not such a hero after all. The heads of the college thought otherwise. The snake and whip also were placed high up against the wall in the college museum, close beside the woman's clog which was split by a thunderbolt, and who wasn't hurt. They made part of the catalogue of the blue-coat guides. Nay, even Jabez may have run the rapid chronicle from the reel himself. But the pain and shock of having wilfully killed a living creature neutralized and prevented the harm which might have followed self-glorification. The long-unknown secret spoiler of the dairy had been such a blemish on the spotless character of the Chatham Hospital, such a scandal in its little world, that his capture became of sufficient importance for Dr. Thomas Stone to communicate to the Reverend Joshua Brooks on his next visit to the library, Jabez being considered a sort of protégé of his. Before the day was out, the parson found his cough troublesome, and of course went to Mrs. Clue's for horehound drops. "Well, what do you think a young cheaterfish is now?" came raspily from his lips as he leaned on the counter, evidently prepared for a gossip, shop chairs being unheard of superfluities in those days. Mrs. Clews knew perfectly well whom the parson meant by young cheaterfishes. Indeed, the boy on his rare holidays had been a customer, as were the boys of college and grammar school generally. "Now, why, what's the lad been doing?" "Now, wrong, I reckon." You see, she had faith in the boy's open countenance. That's as folk think," he growled, keeping his own opinion to himself. "I don't suppose I need to tell you the hubbub there's been over there," jerking his finger in the direction of the college, "about the stolen milk. That tale's old enough." Mrs. Clews nodded her mob cap in assent. "Well, that lad Jabez found a snake 4 feet long, with its head in the milk pans the other morning. The sly thief turned spiteful, and the two had a battle royal all to themselves in the cellar. The pugnacious rapscallion had a whip in his hand, and he lashed the snake to death." Mrs. Clews echoed his last words and uplifted her hands in amazement. A snake was a terrible reptile to her. "Ah, and then blubbered like a cryababby because he'd killed it. What do you think of that, Dame Clews?" I think he was a brave little thing to face a sarpent, but I think I find sight more of his blubbering, as you call it," said she, taking a tin canister from her shelf and putting it on the counter with an emphatic bounce. "Ah, I thought I could match the young fool with an old one," said he derisively, to hide his own satisfaction, as he took his short legs to the door. But Mrs. Clews called him back, put a large paper parcel in his hand, and said, "Here, Jotty, see you give these sweetmeats to your cryababby, and tell him an old woman says there's no harm in fighting in self-defence with any kind of a snake, or for his own good name, or to protect the helpless. But if he fights just to show off his own bravery, he's a coward. And you tell him from me never to be ashamed of tears he has shed in repentance for injury he may have done to any living thing. Now see you tell him, parson, and maybe my preachment may be worth more to him than my cakes or toffee, or your sermons." And she nodded her head till the cap-border flapped like a bird's wings. Dame, you be wagging that tongue and much of yours in my pulpit next," said he gruffly. But he delivered the parcel and the preachment both faithfully, and moreover turned over his stores of old school books for a Latin grammar, which he put into the hand of Jabez, with a promise to instruct the boy in the language if he would like to learn. Forthwith Jabez, not caring to seem ungracious, though without any special liking for the task, had to encroach upon his playhouse for a new study, underrated by the pupil, overrated by the teacher. Could Joshua Brooks have put mathematical instruments within his reach, or given him pencils and colours, the boy's eyes would have sparkled, and study been a pleasure. Chapter the 10th. First Antagonism. The extensive oblong enclosure, known as Ardwick Green, situated at the south-eastern extremity of the town, on the left-hand side of the highway to Stockport and London, was, in 1809, part of a suburban village, and from Piccadilly to a blacksmith's forge a little beyond Ardwick Bridge, fields and hedges were interspersed with the newly erected houses along Bank Top. The green, studded here and there with tall poplars and other trees, was fenced round with quite an army of stumpy wooden posts, some 6 feet apart, connected by squared iron rods, a barrier against cattle only. A long, slightly serpentine lake spread its shining waters from end to end, within the soft circlet of green, and this grassy belt served as a promenade for the fashionable inhabitants. And there must have been such in that village of Ardwick early in the century, as now, for the one bell in the tiny turret of St. Thomas's small, plain, red-brick chapel rang a fashionable congregation into its neat pews to listen to the well-toned organ and the devoutly toned voice of the perpetual curate, the Reverend R. Tweddle, if we may credit an historian of the time. Red-brick church, red-brick houses, hard and cold outside, solid and roomy and comfortable within, as Georgian architecture ever was, overlooked green and pond, but luckily overlooked them from a reasonable distance, and moreover did not elbow each other too closely, but were individually set in masses of foliage which toned down the staring brickwork. Time and smoke have done so more effectually since. One of the best and best-looking of these houses, near the church, was the one in which the delicate Mrs. Aspinall had presided for a few brief years. An iron palisade, enclosing a few shrubs and evergreens, separated it from the wide roadway, but behind the screen of brick ran a formal but extensive garden and orchard, well kept and well stocked, with a fish pond as formal in the midst. Fish ponds encourage damp, and damp encourages frogs, efts, and their kin. Here they abounded, and Master Lawrence had a sort of instinctive belief that they were created solely for his sport and amusement. Mr. Aspinall, his father, immersed in business during the day and occupied with friends at home or abroad until late hours at night, saw very little of his son, who was thus consigned to servants during those hours not spent or supposed to be spent at a preparatory school close at hand. The boy was quick and intelligent, had his mother's amber curls and azure eyes, her delicate skin and brilliant colour, but the handsome face had more of the father therein, and was too unformed to brook description here. What he might have been with other training is not to be told, but under the supposition that he inherited from his mother's fragile constitution, he had been woefully spoiled and pampered. Opposition to his will was forbidden. Bear with him, Kitty, for my sake, and do not thwart him, or you will break his fine spirit, had been Mrs. Aspinall's dying charge to her old nurse, and as every demonstration of temper was ascribed by both parents to this same fine spirit, what wonder that he grew up masterful and worse. His imperious disposition early ingratiated him into the favour of Bob, his father's groom, and this man, thinking no evil, ignorantly sowed the seeds of cruelty in his young heart. When the horses were singed, the boy was allowed to be a spectator. If a whelp had his ears cropped, or the end of its tail bitten off, he was treated to a sight. If a brood of kittens or a litter of puppies had to be drowned, Master Lawrence was sure to be in at the death. He was taken to surreptitious cockfights and rat hunts, and though when too late Mr. Aspinall turned the man away for inclining his son to low pursuits, nothing was said or done to counteract these lessons of cruelty. No wonder, then, that to him the sight of pain inflicted brought pleasure, or that inhumanity went hand in hand with self-will. One incident, a real one, will suffice to show what Lawrence Aspinall was when Jabez Clegg shed tears over the snake he had killed perforce. Kitty was in the kitchen alone. The maids were in other parts of the house. She was sitting close to a blazing fire on account of her rheumatics, and was in a doze. The evening was drawing in. Master Lawrence, coming direct from the garden and the fish pond, burst open the kitchen door with a whoop which made Kitty start from her nap in a fright. Thereupon he set up a loud laugh as the poor old woman held her hand to her side and panted for breath. In his hand was his pocket handkerchief, tied like a bundle, in which something living seemed to move and palpitate. They were young frogs, in various stages of development. "Now, Kitty," said he, "I'll show you some rare sport," and taking one of the living frogs out of the handkerchief, deliberately threw it into the midst of the glowing fire. "There, Kitty, did you hear that?" cried he in rapture, as the poor animal uttered a cry of agony, almost human, whilst he danced on the hearth like a frantic savage round a sacrificial fire. "Oh, Master Lawrence, don't do that! Don't be so cruel!" appealed Kitty, piteously. But he had drawn another forth, and crying, "Cruel! It's fun, Kitty, fun!" tore it limb from limb and threw it piecemeal into the blaze. "There's another, and there's another!" he shouted in glee, as the rest followed in swift succession, and Kitty, shrieking in pain and horror, ran from the kitchen, bringing the cook and housemaid downstairs with her cries. For the first time in his life, Mr. Aspinall administered a sound castigation to his son, regretting that he had not done it earlier. No more was said of his son's fine spirit, but prompt to act, he lost no time in seeking his admission into the free grammar school, and either to spare him the long daily walk, in tenderness for his health, Ardwick was more than a mile away, or to place him under strict supervision, boarded Lawrence with one of the masters. Yet he gave that master no clue to his son's besetting sin, so he was left free to tantalize and torment every weaker creature within his orbit, from the schoolmaster's cat, which he shod with walnut shells, to the youngest schoolboy, whose boots he tore and hid, whose hair he pulled, whose caps and frills he soused in the mud. It was a misfortune for himself and others that his pocket money was more abundant than that of his fellows. Never had the apple woman or Mrs. Clews a more lavish customer, or one who distributed his purchases more freely. Boys incapable of discriminating between generosity and profusion dubbed him generous, and that, coupled with his handsome face and spirited bearing, which they mistook for courage, brought him partisans. Thus, long before his first year expired and he was drafted from the law school to the room above, where he came under the keen eye and heavy ferule of Joshua Brooks, he had a body of lads at his beck, many older than himself, ready for any mischief he might propose. As well may be supposed, there was a natural antagonism between the boys of the grammar school and of Chetham's hospital. As at the confluence of two streams the waters chafe and foam and fret each other, so it is scarcely possible for two separate communities, similar yet differing in their constitutions, to have their gateways close together at right angles without frequent collision between the rival bodies. In the great gate of the college, only open on special occasions, was a small door or wicket for ordinary use, and some of the grammar school boys, under pretence of shortening their routes homeward, finding it open, would make free to cross the college yard at a noisy canter, and let themselves out at the far gate on Hunt's Bank. It was a clear trespass. They were frequently admonished by one official or another. Their passage was disputed by the Blue-coat boys, but they persisted in setting up a right of road, and opposition only gave piquancy to their bravado. That which began with individual assumption soon attained the character of boldly asserted party aggression, and as the Blue-coat boys were as determined to preserve their rights as the others were to invade them, many and well contested were the consequent fights and struggles, and thus the two boys, Jabez Clegg and Lawrence Aspinall, brought together first at the church door and the baptismal font, came into collision again. But now there was no deferential stepping aside of the humble foundling to make way for the merchant's son. They stood upon neutral ground, strangers to each other, equal in their respective participation in the benefits of a charitable foundation. Nay, if anything, Jabez had the higher standpoint. His orphanhood and poverty had given him a right to his position in Humphrey Chetham's hospital. The very wealth of the gentleman's son made Lawrence little better than a usurper in Hugh Oldham's grammar school. But it is no part of the novelist's province to prate of the use or abuse of charitable institutions, or to set class in opposition against class. It is only individual character and action as they bear upon one another with which we have to deal. On more than one occasion Jabez, since his conquest of the snake, the recognised champion of his form, had stopped Lawrence Aspinall at the head of a file of boys, and had done his best to bar their passage through the quadrangle. Success, of course, depended on which school was first released. If in time Jabez planted himself by the little wicket with one or two companions, and like Leonidas at Thermopylae, fought bravely for possession of the pass, and generally contrived to beat off the intruders. Sometimes the Blue-coat boys made a sortie from the yard, and falling upon the others pell-mell, left and bore away marks of the contest in swollen lips and black eyes. At length matters were brought to a crisis. Thrice had Lawrence and his clique been repulsed, and the shame of their defeat heightened by derisive shouts from a tribe of Millgate urchins. "Here's the grammar school lads, beat by yellow petticoats again. Yellow petticoats forever. College boys against school, hooray!" Master Lawrence might have ground his teeth and harangued his followers without obtaining an additional recruit or spurring them to a fresh attempt, but for the taunts of the rabble. But the ignominy of defeat by petticoated college boys was too much for the blood of the grammar school, and youngsters threw themselves into the party quarrel, who had hitherto stood aloof. Lawrence Aspinall was superseded. A big raw-boned fellow named Travis took the lead, and rallied round him not only the lads from the lower school, but the bulk of the juniors in the upper room. It is only fair to add that the senior students were in no wise cognisant of the league, or, being so, carefully shut their eyes and ears. As the result of this organisation, on a set day towards the close of October, when the dusk gathered as the school dispersed, the boys who ran down the wide steps from the upper, and the juveniles who ran up from the lower room, instead of darting forward with a whoop and halloo through the iron gate on their homeward way, clustered together within the schoolyard, and made way for seniors and masters to pass out before them. "Get off home with you, and don't loiter there," cried Joshua Brooks as he turned in at his own gate and saw the crowd massing together in the outer playground. "Get home yourself, St. Crispin," shouted Lawrence, but not before the house door had closed upon the irascible master. All books and slates not purposely left in school were consigned to 3 or 4 of the smallest boys, duly instructed to carry them to Hunt's Bank in readiness for their owners. For a week or more the college boys had been unmolested. Not a forbidden foot had stepped within the wicket. The schoolmaster had remarked to the governor, in the presence of his pupils, that he thought Dr. Smith must have prohibited further intrusion. All the greater was the surprise that dusky October afternoon, when a troop of young ruffians, who had stolen quietly one by one through the wicket and kept under the cavernous shade of the deep gateway until all were within, rushed with vociferous shouts from under cover and tore across the large yard in the direction of the other gate, daring anyone to check them. The college boys, just emerging from their schoolroom door in the corner, were, for the moment, taken aback. Then, from the mouth of Joshua Brooks, new Latin scholar, rang clear and distinct Humphrey Chetham's motto, "Quod tuum tene," what you have, hold, and the Blue-coat boys, with one George Pilkington for their leader, threw themselves at that rallying cry like a great wave headlong upon the intruders. They met the shock as a rock meets a wave, and down went many a gallant Blue-coat in the dust. Up they were in an instant, face to face with the besiegers, and then, each singling out an opponent, fought or wrestled for the mastery with all the courage and animosity, if not the skill, of practised combatants. Ben Travis and George Pilkington fought hand to hand, and Jabez, not for the first time, measured his strength with Lawrence. Heavier, stronger, older by a few months, Jabez might have overmatched his antagonist, but Lawrence had profited by the lessons of Bob, the discarded groom, and every blow was planted skilfully and told. Then Bob's teachings had been none of the most chivalrous, and Lawrence took unfair advantage. He struck below the belt, and then tripping Jabez up, like the coward that he was, kicked him as he lay prostrate with the fury of a savage. Governor, schoolmaster, librarian and porter had hastened to the scene, but the assailants nearly doubled the number of the college boys and set lawful authority at defiance, hurling at them epithets such as only schoolboys could devise. Fortunately, their own blue-coat boys were amenable to discipline, and, called off, one by one retreated to the house, often with pursuers close at their heels. Then the grammar school tribe set up a scornful, triumphant shout, and with Ben Travis and Lawrence Aspinall at their head, marched out of the college yard at the Huntsbank gate, exulting in their victory, even though they left one of their bravest little antagonists insensible behind them. Chapter 11. The Blue-Coat Boy. Those were rough days, when an occasional brawl was supposed essential to test the mettle of man or boy, so that bruises and black eyes, the result of an encounter for the honour of the school, were passed over with much lighter penalties than would be dealt out nowadays if young gentlemen in a public academy descended to blackguardism. At that time, too, the pupils of the grammar school assembled at 7 in the morning, and sure punishment awaited the laggard who failed to present himself for prayers. There were few loiterers on that drear October morning. Conscience and perhaps a dread of consequences had kept the preceding day's war party sufficiently awake, even where sore limbs did not. But with the exception of a few smart raps with the ferrule to warm cold fingers, and a general admonition little heeded, the early hours of the morning passed quietly enough, more congratulatory than prophetic. That day went by, and the next. Lawrence Aspinall, whose science had saved his head from more damage than a cut lip, was especially boastful, and, after his own underhand fashion, strove to stir big Ben Travis to fresh demonstrations. Then a cloud loomed on the horizon and darkened every master's brow. Another whisper was in circulation that Governor Terry had been seen to enter the headmaster's ancient black-and-white old house, and had been closeted with Dr. Smith for more than an hour. Still the quiet was unbroken, and to the wise the very calm was ominous. The 2nd of November brought a revelation. On the slightly raised floor of the high school, at the Millgate end of the room, sat not only Dr. Jeremiah Smith, but the trustees of the school, the Reverend Joshua Brooks, and the assistant masters, and with them was Governor Terry of the Chetham Hospital, all grave and stern. Dr. Smith's mild face was unusually severe, and Joshua's shaggy brows lowered menacingly over his angry eyes. The senior pupils, chiefly young men preparing for college, were ranged on either side. As the last of these awful personages filed in through the two-leaved door and took his place, the palpitating hearts of the delinquents beat audibly, and courage oozed from many a clammy palm. The boys were summoned from the lower school, and one by one, name by name, Ben Travis and his followers were called to take their stand before this formidable tribunal. Lawrence Aspinall shrinking edgeways as if to screen himself from observation. There was little need for Dr. Smith to strike his ferrule on the table to command attention. Silence was so profound. Even nervous feet forgot to shuffle. Dr. Smith's commanding eye swept the trembling rank from end to end as he stood with impressive dignity to address them. After a brief exordium in which he recounted the several charges brought against the boys by Governor Terry, he proceeded to say that the good character of the Manchester Grammar School was imperilled by lawless conduct, such as the boys before him had exhibited the previous Tuesday in forcibly entering and then rioting within the college yard. One of the youths, most likely Ben Travis, blurted forth that they had a right to go through the college yard, and that the college boys stopped them. "You mistake," said the doctor sternly. "There is no public right of road through the college yard. Permission is courteously granted, But there is no right. There is a right for the public to pass to and from the college and its library on business within the hours the gates are open, but even that must be in order and decency. Your conduct was that of barbarians, not gentlemen." At this point of the proceedings, Jabez Clegg came into the schoolroom, leaning on the arm of George Pilkington. The face of the latter was bruised and swollen, but Jabez looked deplorable. His long blue overcoat was rent in more than one place. He walked with a limp. A white bandage round his head made his white face whiter still, showing more distinctly the livid and discoloured patches under the half-closed eyes. In obedience to a nod from Governor Terry, George Pilkington led his blue-coat brother to a seat beside him, but Dr. Smith, drawing the boy gently to his side, removed the bandage and showed Jabez to the school with one deeply cut eyebrow plastered up. "What boy among you has been guilty of this outrage?" he asked sternly. There was no answer. Some of the little ones took out their handkerchiefs and began to whimper, fearing condign punishment. The doctor repeated his question. The boys looked from one to another, but there was still no reply. Lawrence Aspinall edged farther behind his coadjutor, but he had not the manliness either to confess or regret. His only fear was detection or betrayal by a traitor. There was little fear of that. Grammar school boys have a detestation of a sneak. "Boys, we cannot permit the perpetrator of such an outrage to remain in your midst. He must be expelled." Still no one spoke. "Do you think you could recognize your assailant, the boy who kicked you, after you were down?" A murmur ran around the school as the classes were ordered to defile slowly past Dr. Smith's desk. Ben Travis walked with head erect. He would have scorned such a deed. And Lawrence tried to do the same, but his cruel blue eyes could not meet those of his possible accuser. There was a struggle going on in the heart of Jabez. It was in his power to revenge himself for many taunts and sarcasms, and much previous abuse. He called to mind, for thought is swift, that Shrove Tuesday when Lawrence and his friends caught him, as he descended Mrs. Clew's steps with a pennyworth of humbugs in his hand, and snatching his cap from his head, kicked it about Half Street and the churchyard as a football, and he seemed to feel again the twitch at his dark hair and the dreadful pain in his spine and loins, as they bent him backwards over the coping of the low wall in order to wrest his sweets from him, and held him there perforce till stout Mrs. Clew's arm with a rolling pin came to his rescue, laying about him vigorously, and kept him in her back parlour until he revived. Forgive and forget are words for the angels, and Jabez was not an angel, but a boy with quick beating pulses and a vivid memory. There was a fight going on in his breast, fiercer than either that in Half Street or that in the college yard. His sore, stiff limbs and smarting brow urged him like voices to pay him off for all, and revenge began to have a sweet savour in his mouth. As he hesitated, watching the slow approach of his foe amongst his nobler mates, a harsh voice behind him called out, "Jabez, why do you not answer Dr. Smith?" The emphasis Joshua Brooks had laid upon the Jabez recalled the boy's better self. The oft-repeated text flashed across his mind. Jabez was an honourable man, and it shaped his reply. "Well, sir, it was almost dark, and he was going to add too dark to distinguish features, but he recollected that that would be a falsehood, and lying was no more honourable than malice." "And you could not recognise him, you mean?" suggested Dr. Smith. His lip quivered. "No, sir, I do not mean that. It was very dark, but I think I should know him again. But, oh, if you please, sir, I should not like to turn him out of school. You see, we were all fighting together, and we were all in a passion, and it would be very mean of me to turn him out of school because he hurt me in a fight." Jabez did not say a fair fight. "Ah," said Dr. Smith, and turning to Mr. Terry, asked, "Are all the Chetham lads reared on the same principle?" Then there was a low-voiced discussion amongst trustees and masters. Finally Dr. Smith turned round. His clear eye had detected the culprit as he winced beneath the gaze of Jabez, but the injured boy had forgiven, and it was not for him to condemn. Again he spoke, proclaimed how Jabez had magnanimously declined to single out his cowardly antagonist, and that the boy, whoever he might be, had to thank his most honourable victim that he was not ignominiously expelled. Then, quietly but emphatically, he pronounced the decision of the trustees, that instant expulsion should follow any or every repetition of the offence which had called them together. Not only the expulsion of the ringleaders, but of all concerned, and that even a fair fight between a grammar school and a blue-coat boy should be visited with suspension pending enquiry, the offender to be expelled, whether from school or college. "Good lad, Jabez, good lad," said Joshua Brooks to him, as George Pilkington helped his limping steps from the room. On the broad flat step outside the door, they encountered Big Ben Travis, who caught the hand of Jabez in a rough grip, with the exclamation, "Give us your fist, my young buck. You've more pluck in your finger than that carroty Aspinall has in his whole carcass, the mean cur. And look you, my lad, if any of them set on you again, I'll stand by and see fair play, or I'll fight for you if it's a big chap, or my name's not Ben Travis." "Who talks of fighting? Haven't you had enough for one while, you great raw-boned brute? You'd better keep your ready fists in your pockets, Travis, if you don't want to be kicked out of school." After which gruff reminder Joshua left them, and Jabez went back to the college with one more friend in the world, but that friend was not Lawrence Aspinall. He, smarting under a sense of obligation, shrunk away to bite his nails and vent his spleen in private, conscious that he was shunned by his classmates and despised by honest Ben Travis. As months and seasons sped onwards, they plucked the hairs from Simon Clegg's crown and left a bald patch to tell of care or coming age. They stole the roundness from Bessie's figure, the hope from her heart and eyes. There was less vigour in the beat of her batting wand, less elasticity in her step. The periodical holidays and cheering visits of Jabez were the only pleasant breaks in the monotonous life of the Cleggs. Beyond the knowledge obtained at the billeting office in King Street that Tom Hume had entered the army and gone abroad with his regiment, no tidings of the self-exiled soldier had come to them. In the great vortex of war, his name had been swallowed up and lost, but she never said aye to Matthew Cooper, though he waited and waited, smoking his Sunday pipe by the fireside, even till his own Molly was old enough to have a sweetheart and to want to leave her father's crowded hearth for a quieter one of her own. Those same months and years added alike to the stature and attainments of Jabez Clegg and Lawrence Aspinall, though in very unequal ratio. The former, though he had long since astonished Simon with his fluent rendering of the big Bible, was but a plodding scholar of average ability, the range of whose studies was limited, notwithstanding Parson Joshua's voluntary Latin lessons. The latter had an aptitude for learning, which made his masters press him forward, and Joshua Brooks forgave the tricks he played. His translations were so clear and so correct. Yet when he wrote stinging couplets, or St. Crispin on the parson's door, or put cobbler's wax on the pedagogue's chair, the covert reference to his parentage, St. Crispin being the patron saint of cobblers, stung the irascible man more than the damage to curse him here, and in his wrath he birched his pupil into penitence. His penitence took a peculiar form, a discovery was made that a general dance in the schoolroom would shake the pewter platters and crockery down from dresser and corner cupboard in Joshua's house adjoining. Whenever the dominie had growled over bad lessons with least cause, Lawrence was sure to propose a grand hornpipe after school hours. Back would rush Joshua fast as his short legs would carry him, spluttering with passion. But the nimbler lads disappeared when they heard the crash, and as a rule, Joshua's temper cooled before morning. Lawrence Aspinall's chief source of amusement from his first entrance into the grammar school had been the crippled father of Joshua Brooks. As the old fellow staggered home drunk, the street boys would hoot at him, pull him about, pelt him with mud, and mock at him, till his impotent fury found vent in a storm of vile and opprobrious language. Lawrence was sure to enjoy a scene of this kind, but he was generally sly enough to act as prompter, not as principal. The old man was a great angler, and that he might enjoy unmolested his favourite pastime, his son had obtained from Colonel Hanson permission for him to fish in Strangeways Park ponds. Thither he had an empty hogshead conveyed, and the crippled old cobbler, with a flask of rum for company, sat within it often the night through to catch fish. The Irk had not then lost its repute for fine eels, and old Brooks, who by the way wore his hair in a pigtail, was likewise wont to plant himself with rod and line on what was the Waterworth field, on the Irwell side of Irk Bridge, to catch eels. Returning one afternoon, Joshua was busied with clerical duties. Lawrence Aspinall and his fellows met the old man staggering along, with his rod over his shoulder and a basket of eels in one hand. He had called at the packhorse for a dram, and went on, as was his wont, talking noisily to himself. He had steered round the corner in safety, but hearing one lively voice call out, "Here's old Fishtail," and another, "Here's St. Crispin's cripple," and a third, "Make way for Diogenes," as he was passing the High Master's ancient house, he gave a lurch, meaning to reprove them solemnly. The top of his rod caught in the prominent pillar of the doorway, and was torn from his insecure grasp. Striving to recover it, he pitched forward, and in falling dropped his basket in the mud, and set the writhing long-lived fish at liberty to swim in the gutter swollen with recent rain. The lounging lads at once set up a shout, but Lawrence, with a timely recollection that the front of Dr. Smith's was scarcely the most convenient place for his purpose, winked at his companions, and, with an aspect of mock commiseration, politely assisted the old man to rise, begging the others to capture the eels and carry the basket for him, and under pretence of putting the angler's rod in order, contrived to fasten the hook to the end of his old-fashioned pigtail. Then he helped his unsteady steps until they were fairly out of Dr. Smith's sight and hearing, but they did not suffer him to reach his son's house before they showed their true colours. Loosing his hold, Lawrence snatched at the rod, and darting with it towards the college gate, cried out in high glee, "I've been fishing! Look at the fine snig, that is an eel, I've caught!" And as he capered about, he dragged the poor old cripple hither and thither, backwards by his pigtail, to which hook and line were attached. Old Brute screamed in impotent rage and pain. The boys laughed and shouted the louder. The one with his basket set it on his head, and paraded about crying, "Who'll buy my snigs, fine fresh snigs," with the nasal drawl of a genuine fish seller. Once or twice the old man fell down, uttering awful threats and imprecations, but Lawrence only laughed the more, and jerked him up again with a smart twitch of the line, which was a strong one, and the other 3 or 4 young ruffians put up their shoulders and limped about, singing, "The fishes drink water, old Crispin drinks gin, but the fishes come out when the hook he throws in, tol-de-rol." It may be wondered that none of the neighbours interfered, but it must be remembered that they were accustomed not only to the uproar of a boyish multitude, but to the drunken ravings of old Brooks, who was an intolerable nuisance. Public traffic then was not as now, and policemen were unborn. The satisfaction of Lawrence was at its height. He kept hold of the line. One of his comrades, named Barrett, lashed the persecuted man with an eel for a whip, and their mirth was boisterous, when Jabez, now 13, came quietly through the wicket on an errand from the governor. He took in the scene at a glance. He could not stand by and see injustice done. His dark eyes flashed with indignation as he dashed forward, pulling the line from the hand of Lawrence, and tried to disentangle the cruel hook from the unfortunate pigtail. "Who asked you to interfere, you petticoated jackanapes?" bawled Lawrence, darting forward, his face as red as his hair, at the same time dealing Jabez a heavy blow on the chest. "My duty," answered Jabez stoutly, taking no notice of the sneer at himself. "How could you gentlemen torment a poor old cripple like that?" "He's a drunken old sot," cried Barrett. "It's downright cruel," continued Jabez, as he stood between the jabbering drunkard and his tormentors. "We're no more cruel than he is. He's been catching fishes all day. We've only given him a taste of his own hook, and we'll have none of your meddling." And out went the pugilistic arm of Lawrence straight from the shoulder to deal another blow, when it was caught from behind by the bony hand of Ben Travis, bigger and stronger by 2 years' growth, whilst the other hand gripped his jacket collar. "So you're at your cowardly tricks again, Aspinall," exclaimed he, holding the other as if in a vice. "But if I see you lay another finger on that lad, I'll report you to Dr. Smith." "Oh, you'd turn sneak, would you?" sneered Lawrence, striving to twist himself loose, and disordering his broad white frill in the endeavour. "I'd think I did the grammar school a service to turn either you or Barrett out of it, I would. Think of you setting on that noble chap, who won't turn tell-tale, though he'll carry the mark of your boot to his grave with him," pointing with outstretched hand to Jabez, who by this time was handing old Brooks over to the grumbling care of Tabitha, and whose right eyebrow yet showed a red seam. Travis relaxed his hold of Lawrence, and he shook himself free. Some warm altercation followed. There was a scowl of sullen defiance on Aspinall's face, and an evil glance towards Jabez, which Travis observing, with a significant nod he linked his arm in that of the blue-coat boy, and never left him till he reached his destination, Mr. Hyde's ancient and picturesque tea-shop in Market Street Lane. Yet it meant a detour by Cateaton Street to leave an important note from Dr. Stone at the shop of Ford, the dealer in rare boots, and a stretch up Smithy Door to the marketplace, where the office of Arup the printer confronted them, and the trusty messenger had to wait. Chapter 12. The Gentleman. That afternoon a gentleman, who had witnessed part of the foregoing scene from the breeches-maker's window, whether he had gone for a pair of buckskin riding gloves, struck by the dauntless manner of Jabez, related what he had seen to his wife, Mrs. Ashton, the stately sister of Mrs. Chadwick, whilst Augusta, their 8-year-old daughter, sat on a footstool by her side, hemming a bandana handkerchief for her father, an inveterate snuff-taker, occasionally putting in a word, as only spoiled daughters did in those days. "Mamma, I dare say that's the little boy Cousin Ellen told me about." "Pooh, pooh, Augusta," said Mr. Ashton, tapping the lid of his snuff-box, and then, from force of a habit, handing it to his wife, the wave of whose hand put it back. "Pooh, pooh, child. Do you think there's only one blue-coat boy in the town? Beside, he was not such a little boy. I know I thought something of myself when I was his size," said Mr. Ashton, dusting the snuff from his ruffles as he spoke. "But he would be a little boy when Ellen knew him first. She says it was before I was born." "He could not be a blue-coat boy then, my dear," observed Mrs. Ashton. "He was too young. But Ellen showed him to me when we went to the college at Easter, and she says he has killed a snake, a real live snake, Papa, and Aunt Chadwick bought Ellen such a pretty pincushion he had worked, and oh, such a handsome bead purse. Mr. Ashton smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm. "Ah, I think I have heard of him before. He is a sort of protégé of Parson Brooks." "He is a very honest boy," appended Mrs. Ashton, as she examined Augusta's hemming by the light of the nearest wax candle. "Ellen lost Prince William's shilling that same day. You know, she always wears it dangling from her neck, absurd as it is for a great girl of 15. "Well," said Augusta, looking up inquiringly. "Well, my dear, the very next afternoon the boy Jabez Clegg knocked at the door in Oldham Street, bearing the shilling, which he said he had found in sweeping the library, and remembered seeing it on Miss Chadwick's neck. Many a boy at Easter would have spent it in cakes or toffee. I suppose, to use one of your favourite maxims, he must have thought honesty the best policy," remarked her husband. "Yes, and duty its own reward, for he refused the half-crown that Sarah offered him." Mr. Ashton took another pinch of snuff with grave consideration, then put the box, after some deliberation, into his deep waistcoat pocket, and again flapped the snuff off ruffles and neckcloth ends. "Wouldn't take the money, you say?" "Would not take it," his wife repeated, folding up the finished handkerchief. After a pause, Mr. Ashton said, with his head on one side, "I think I shall look after that younker. What is he like?" "Oh, that I cannot tell. I was not with them, but I think Sarah said he had got an ugly scar on one of his eyebrows." Mr. Ashton brought down his hand with a clap on that of Augusta, resting on his knee. "Then my little Lancashire witch, the poor cripple's champion and Ellen's hero of romance, will be one and the same. I must certainly look after that lad." But even as Mr. Ashton came to that conclusion, Jabez was in mortal peril, and his romance and theirs threatened to end at the beginning. Lawrence Aspinall was not of a temper to brook interference with his sport, or to be treated as the inferior of a common charity boy. Since the hour that Jabez had declined to single him out for punishment, he had resented the sense of his own inferiority, which conscience played upon him. In refusing to tender either thanks or apology, at Ben Travis's instigation, he lost caste in the school. The knowledge rankled in his breast. Against the debt of gratitude he owed to Jabez, he laid up a fund of envy and spite, out of which he meant to pay him in full the first opportunity. That opportunity had arrived. There were some birds of his own feather who stuck by him, of whom Ned Barrett was one. Old Brooks had been too drunk to swear positively who had molested him, or to obtain credence if he did, but the inopportune arrival of Jabez and Ben Travis had made detection certain, and nothing was Joshua Brooks so sure to punish with severity as an attack on the father who made his life a burden to him. On the principle that they might as well be hanged for a sheep as a lamb, the noble five resolved to waylay the blue-coat boy on his return, and either extract from him a promise of secrecy, or give him a sound drubbing for his pains. They were too light-minded for long conference. To put the old breeches-maker off the scent, all dispersed but one, Kit Townley, who pulled a top from his pocket and whipped away at it with as much energy as ever did his Anglo-Saxon ancestors. Perhaps he thought he had a meddlesome college boy under his lash. After a time the others sauntered back one by one from contrary directions. There was more top-whipping, and some of the whips and tops were new. Then, when they saw they were unobserved, they adjourned to the schoolyard, and laying a cap on the broad step, 2 or 3 of them sat down to a game at cobnut, so that if any unlikely straggler did come that way, there might be an apparent reason for their presence. It was late in the year. The breeches-maker was seated at early tea, and so were most of his neighbours. The twilight was coming gently down, and the boys, tired of waiting, were about to go home to their own. Aspinall expecting a reprimand for being late. Jabez, who had been delayed at the office of Harrop, the printer in the marketplace, came briskly up with a parcel in his hand just as they reached the gate. One of them snatched the parcel from him and ran with it into the schoolyard. As a natural consequence, Jabez followed to regain his property. That was just what they wanted. The light iron gate was pushed to, and there they were, shut in and screened from observation, between the deserted grammar school on the one hand and the college schoolroom on the other, which, with the dormitory above, was equally sure to be empty at that hour. They were free to torment him as they pleased. The parcel was tossed from hand to hand with subdued glee, and their whiplashes and strung cobnuts cut at his arms and shoulders as Jabez sprang forward and darted hither and thither, perplexed and baffled in his efforts to recover it. Once or twice it went down on the damp ground, and gained in grime what it lost in shape. "Oh, dear, dear, do give me my parcel," cried Jabez in perplexity. "Our governor will think I've been loitering." "And so you have, you canting yellow skirt. You stopped to put your long finger in our pie," was the swift retort of Lawrence, as he interposed his body between Jabez and the boy who held his lost charge. "And you went off with Travis, wasting your time," added Kit Townley. "I never waste my time on an errand." "Oh, Miss Nancy never wastes time on an errand," mimicked Ned Barrett, and still they kept the boy on the run until he leaned, out of breath, against the wall, which served as a parapet above the river. Then, the disputed prize being kept by Kit Townley at a respectable distance, Lawrence advanced to parley with him, offering to restore his parcel and let him go if he would take a solemn oath, which he dictated, to maintain silence on all which had transpired that afternoon. "I cannot. I must account for my time," firmly answered Jabez, "and I must account for that dirty parcel." "Tell them that you tumbled down and hurt yourself," suggested Aspinall. "I cannot. It would be untrue." At this the lads set up a loud guffaw, as if truth were somewhat out of fashion. But the one who stood nearest the gate with the parcel looked restless, as if beginning to be tired of the whole business. Just then Lawrence went blustering up to the college boy, and thrusting his face forward said, "If you don't go down on your marrow bones this instant and swear to tell no tales, we'll pitch you over the wall." "You dare not," boldly retorted Jabez with a set face. "Oh, daren't we? We'll see that. Lend a hand." "No, you dare not," repeated he, planting himself firmly against the wall. There was a sudden rush. They closed round him, more in bravado than with any intent to do him bodily harm. Sliding him up against the smooth-worn brickwork, they hoisted him above their shoulders, meaning to hold him there, but in their eagerness they had thrust him too far, and crowding on each other, one being jostled let go, and Jabez toppled over the precipice. There was a scream, a splash in the water. Tabitha, taking clothes from a line in the backyard, cried out, "What is that?" Parson Brute's startled pigeons flew from their dovecote, and wheeling round in widening circles cooed affrightedly. The white-faced boy stood aghast. Unless his fall had been seen from the opposite croft, their victim would be drowned before any aid they could bring was available. A wide circuit must be taken before a bridge could be reached. Buildings blocked up that side of the river. They looked at each other and spoke in whispers. Then, with an animal instinct of self-preservation, sneaked off in silence and terror, leaving him to his fate. Not all. Kit Townley, who held the parcel, had drawn near to remonstrate. With a shriek he threw down the paper, and hardly conscious what he did, tore wildly through the gates and across the college yard, to startle the first he met with the alarm that a college boy was drowning in the Irk.